If Donald Trump refuses to leave the White House or refuses to engage in a peaceful transition of power after losing his reelection bid, what's the military likely to do? That's a question that I've heard many people ask. It's a question that I've had ever since Trump made it very clear on multiple occasions that he won't accept the outcome of the election if he loses. Well, the Defense Department insists that they will do all they can to keep the armed forces out of the elections. So the military is really meant to be apolitical. And we've found ourselves in this unprecedented situation where for the first time, there is a possibility that the president would refuse a peaceful transition of power. And so does that apolitical label still apply to the military if you have this unprecedented situation? Quite honestly, we're getting some mixed signals from members of the military. One thing that is clear is that former military generals are calling on the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, General Mark Milley, to do something if Trump refuses to leave the White House. But here's what Mark Milley says. I believe deeply in the principle of an apolitical US military. In the event of a dispute over some aspect of the elections, by law, US courts and the US Congress are required to resolve any disputes, not the US military. I foresee no role for the US armed forces in this process. Relying on Congress to do anything is pretty terrifying. But retired military men are pushing Milley to reconsider this position. In fact, on August 11th, John Nagel and Paul Yingling, both retired Army officers and Iraq War veterans, published an open letter to General Milley on the website Defense One. Here's what they wrote. In a few months' time, you may have to choose between defying a lawless president or betraying your constitutional oath, they wrote. If Donald Trump refuses to leave office at the expiration of his constitutional term, the United States military must remove him by force, and you must give that order. So Emma, I want to bring you in and get your thoughts on some of this because this New York Times piece also makes it clear that there are discussions within, the military about the possibility of Trump leaving. Like they understand and recognize that this is a problem or could be a potential problem. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm deeply concerned, and I don't really understand the view from some on the left who want to say that Trump is just posturing when he says that he may not accept the election results. This is deeply troubling. This is the kind of thing where you should be hyperbolic about Trump. I know that people are often talking about his decorum and little things he does and his tweets and him being mean to John McCain or whatever. This is well beyond that. This is Trump exhibiting his narcissistic personality traits, right? And also capitalizing on the little landmines he's scattered throughout the American populace, where he's talked about how voter fraud, mail fraud. How can you trust that the Democrats aren't going to print millions of fake ballots? He's going to end up capitalizing on that once the election results roll in and cast doubt on the results. That's 100% going to happen. And then he could not leave power. And then what do? I mean, I think maybe one of the more likely scenarios of what's gonna play out is Trump's gonna force his nominee through either before the election or in the lame duck session. And he's gonna have litigation on whether or not the result was fair of the election. And will the very conservative Supreme Court side with him? I think that's also a likely scenario. I'm not saying it's the number one scenario, but the fact that we're talking about this means that the military needs to step up and say, yes, we will side with what the democratically elected result is, and we will remove Trump if necessary, because who knows what's gonna happen. We have to take him at his word here. Look, Bernie Sanders, we're gonna talk about this later. He's been on the right side of history for 30 years. And the fact that he's coming out, he felt compelled to, by himself, not with Chuck Schumer, not alongside Nancy Pelosi, not alongside other members of the Democratic caucus, come out and say, this is an extreme, real threat, should scare the bejesus out of everybody. This is not something we're playing around with here.
It is interesting to see some people on the left of all, groups, political groups in the country, side with this talking point about how, he's just talking. He's not actually going to refuse to leave. I mean, all of his actions, it's not just about what Trump says. It's all of the actions surrounding his statements, right? He has been hinting that he won't accept the outcome of the election if it appears that he loses. He's been hinting at that for months. In 2016, when he genuinely believed he was gonna lose that election, and most people did, he was planting the same seed, right? Of voter fraud and rigging and all this nonsense to kind of start priming his base and his supporters to question the outcome of the election. And who knows what would have happened if he would have lost and his voters would become, activated to go out there and do something. We've seen what some of his supporters have been doing out during these protests already. And then there's also all the procedural changes that have taken place, right? So for instance, the dismantling of the post office. Oh, is that just a coincidence? Of course it's not. In a year when we're going to rely heavily on mail-in ballots, dismantling the post office is clearly meant to suppress the vote. There were former Trump campaign officials who were caught on tape. We talked about this on the show yesterday, who clearly said suppressing the vote is incredibly important, especially in places like Wisconsin. He specifically mentioned Wisconsin. Then you have, all the nonsense rhetoric from Trump regarding election rigging and voter fraud through mail-in ballots. He's trying to discourage people from voting by mail. I mean, there's a long list of things that he's done. And then the consent decree that expired, which would prevent the Republican Party from sending armed law enforcement to in-person voting places to intimidate voters. That decree expired, and guess what? The first thing the Trump campaign did was hire 50,000 individuals, so-called poll watchers, to show up to these in-person polling locations to intimidate voters. We already got a little taste of that in Virginia with Trump protesters blocking voters from being able to enter the building so they can cast their ballots. So yeah, I don't get it. I don't know if it's like some weird self-preservation thing. I don't know if some members of the left are in complete and utter denial. I don't know if it's because they were, floating this ridiculous tactic and strategy of electing Donald Trump, and then things would get so bad that there would be this mass revolution and we would suddenly magically have this amazing country. That obviously didn't come to fruition. I don't know, but they're not serious people, and I'm not interested in having a conversation with them, especially since the evidence bears out exactly what we're worried about. Someone who has dictatorial tendencies and is gonna refuse to leave. And by the way, it's not just the left. I also wanna call out people like Nancy Pelosi, who she still doesn't seem to really comprehend the kind of threat that Donald Trump is, right? I mean, she was asked if she's gonna do anything about it, if she would even do small procedural things to at least postpone the vote on Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick. And she's like, no, of course we're not gonna do that.
Yeah,
okay.
And to your point, Anna, when you talk about how he still was planting seeds in 2016, and even after he won, he said 3 million illegal immigrants voted for Hillary Clinton so she would win the popular vote with zero evidence, because his ego couldn't take the fact that he lost the popular vote. Since that point, and since he entered politics, he has been planting seeds of misinformation about electoral outcomes throughout the country, so that 35% of the country, the people that support him, they believe it. They believe it. So what can happen on election night is most Democrats, or most of the mail-in ballots are going to be Democrats, right? So it could appear on election night like Trump has a massive victory because his supporters go to the polls. Then there's like this 4-day period where people are doubting what the election results even are. And then that's when he gets the return on his investment of misinformation, because that's when he can make a case that everything's in doubt. It is like an investment in misinformation and sowing discord. And we could see the fruits of it on election day and afterwards.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I do want to just mention a few other things that are worthy of mentioning. Remember, Donald Trump wanted to use the Insurrection Act in order to use federal officials, members of the military specifically, to go after protesters and protests throughout the country. Luckily, the military put its foot down and said, no, we're not going to do it. The Insurrection Act, a 2-century-old law, enables a president to send in active duty military troops to quell disturbances over the objections of governors. So even if state governors are like, no, we don't want this, the Insurrection Act makes it possible for Trump to send military to various states for disturbances, right? Now, Trump, who refers to the armed forces as my military, my generals, has lumped them with other supporters like Bikers for Trump, who could offer backup in the face of opposition, right? So Trump would have no problem utilizing the military to protect him should he refuse to leave the White House after losing the election. But what we're seeing from the military so far, at least active generals, members of the military, is just this unwillingness to engage in this process because they believe that they need to remain apolitical. John Gans, who's a former Defense Department speechwriter, says this: I know that Mark Milley is trying to think his way through, but I have my doubts he can. The problem is that when the military doesn't want to do something, they don't like to think about it. The Pentagon plans for war with Canada, which seems weird, and a zombie apocalypse, but they don't want to plan for a contested election. These are huge questions that have an impact on the reputation of the institution. Now, inside the Pentagon, though, whose leaders are well known for making plans, Defense Department officials said there had been no preparations for sending active duty troops into American streets to quell any civil unrest. So that's a good sign that they're not, hearing from Trump and planning to use the military to go after protesters should protests emerge as a result of Trump refusing to leave office. But it's also become very clear to me that the military is also not planning for what to do if Trump actually does refuse to leave office following the loss of the re-election.
Right, and the thing that I read in that article too that disturbed me was, you're gonna see mass resignations if this is the case. Fine, resign, and then the next guy, the first guy or woman who decides to uphold what Trump wants here, then the buck will stop there. There needs to be a plan for this. We are facing unprecedented times here. When you look at historians, they say they've never seen anything like this in terms of the threat of the threat against our democracy here. And I believe that the military, if they want to be looked at favorably in history, when it blows my mind that most people in politics don't think that far ahead. They need to make plans for this and contingency plans, because this is not going to be pretty no matter how it shakes out, no matter if it's a Biden landslide victory, no matter if it's close. It's gonna be tough sledding.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.